You may already know about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which is the UN's 2030 totalitarian agenda for every country. But do you know there's also now an agenda for you and every person called the Inner Development Goals? I'm Lisa Logan, your host of Parents of Patriots, and today I'm going to tell you all about it. These are the 23 skills across 5 domains you're supposed to cultivate in order to feel personally responsible for the fulfillment of the SDGs.
The Inner Development Goals show what inner shifts or human growth needs to happen in order for us to increase our chances of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals collectively.
We need to sort of focus more inwards, and what is my responsibility in that? What can I contribute to a development that is more sustainable? But in order to be able to reach those sustainability goals, we need to also be able to take the right decisions to get there.
Mental health and well-being is supported by our inner capacities for spirituality and faith, where education is fundamentally oriented towards meaning and purpose in a changing world, rather than mere content delivery for students.
I realize more and more that we cannot reach the sustainability goals if we do not work with our inner development. This does not apply only to universities. This applies to all sectors, all ages.
What we really need is a deliberately developmental society. And depending on how severe you think the situation is, maybe we need a deliberately developmental world. And right now, we're not even talking about at scale the inner dimensions and how we need to change. Because at the core, we are the problem. The way that we're acting in the world and the way that we are solving problems is the problem.
I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation.
We bring now the Inner Development Goals with us as a great source of inspiration when we strengthen and revise our competence development roadmaps and make sure that the Inner Development Goals are integrated into this.
To make the world work better requires highly specialized skills. So what we want to say to people is, yes, it's great that you want to help make the world work better, but you have to get into training.
Hear that, you selfish person who enjoys your energy that comes from fossil fuels and your constitutional republic that values individualism over collectivism? You're a roadblock to their global goals. It's why Ives and the 22 authors cited in this paper conclude that the vast majority of sustainability science has focused on the external world of ecosystems, economic markets, social structures, and governance dynamics. In doing so, a critical second dimension of reality has been neglected: the inner lives of individuals. That's right, your inner life. In other words, the metrics that activists, banks, and investors are using to strong-arm businesses through ESG, or environmental, social, and governance scores, and the methods they're using to transform and collect information on children's values, attitudes, and beliefs through social emotional learning in schools to turn them into activists and implement a social credit system, aren't accelerating the Sustainable Development Goals fast enough. In light of this, they now need to execute a plan to expand their totalitarian control program to not just corporations and students, but to every person through the Inner Development Goals. In fact, you literally heard them say in their own video that this is the purpose of the IDGs, to change behaviors so they can accomplish the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. How are they going to do this? The same way they've accomplished instituting ESG and SEL, public-private partnerships, which is just a roundabout way of saying that governments and businesses are working together to push a top-down fascistic agenda to control society. As Cheryl Pass noted in her column for the Gaston Gazette, the Italian fascist movement in Italy was created by Benito Mussolini. The crux of the fascist movement was corporatism, or also corporativism, as it was known at the time. What Mussolini did was co-opt corporations to do the communal government work of society. If the business refused, well, off with their heads. In today's day and age, it isn't off with their heads, but down with their ESG score, which then risks their ability to have the investment capital necessary from those banks and investors to keep their businesses alive. Public-private partnerships will allow government and corporations to work together to pass laws and enact policies that allow them to force the training of the IDGs in the name of nice-sounding reasons like health, well-being, and flourishing. And then eventually the use of data metrics and accountability will be added in to ensure that enforcement of these trainings are implemented across all systems and institutions. Just like with ESG, where companies have to report on their practices regarding environmental, social, and governance policies in order to not get shunned by activist banks and investors, they also may have to report in the future that, as a part of their health and well-being strategy, they implement trainings to their leadership and employees in the Inner Development Goals. Listen to the purveyors of the Inner Development Goals talk about how IDGs actually dovetail nicely with ESG initiatives.
I had a member reach out to the group. He said, can anyone in the core practitioners group talk to me about the bank leadership team is having trouble understanding how the IDGs are going to help them meet their goals around ESG that are mandated by the German government. And I'm having trouble articulating how to connect that. And I said to him, wow, that could be an entire IDG core group on its own. We feel inner development is one of the real keys to allowing our organizations and the leaders in them to have the capabilities to influence and just understand the need for the kinds of changes that could result in your meeting your ESG goals that are going to satisfy the German government.
All employers start to do this to not risk losing investment capital in an ESG-driven marketplace. Maybe one day all businesses will be forced to become what IGG scientist Robert Keegan calls deliberately developmental organizations. And it will be difficult to find an employer who doesn't pry into your inner beliefs and values. Don't forget how diversity, equity, and inclusion reporting made it so that implicit bias training full of critical race theory concepts infiltrated its way into the workplace just a short time ago, and all employees were forced to participate. It will be this way with the Inner Development Goals. Listen to the Chief Operating Officer of the IDGs relay how Spotify is telling their employees to suck it up in regards to the IDG training, or perhaps another job might be a better fit.
Spotify, they've been working with open and learning mindset. And they do a 3-hour training for everybody that's starting on Spotify, where they say, we are a hyper-growth company. This will be uncomfortable. This will be messy. This will be probably painful. Are you sure this is the place for you? And just sort of accepting that it will be messy creates actually that precondition for accepting that it will be hard and accepting psychological pain. And then they've actually also practiced, how to have that open learning mindset.
Also listen to Jan Arnhem Henriksen, Executive Director of the IDGs, speak about how they're taking cues from other movements on ways to make the responsibility of the inner development of employees a top leadership governance expectation.
So we are asking ourselves the question, how can we use some of the insights maybe from how other movements, like the equality movement, has in some ways succeeded in countries like Sweden, where it's a very strong norm, if you're a manager or a person in power especially, that you need to care about this and work with this systemically. And the least thing you have to do is pay it lip service, because you're going to be thrown out of the boardroom or leadership team. And how can we make the same thing with leadership development or personal development? Because today senior leaders still can say, oh, that's up to you. You mind that with your own psychologist or your own, that this is nothing that we are responsible for doing. Like this, the business of business is business, and that's it. Because of course we can just say that, no, we should just let evolution handle that and it will all be fine. But if we look into our organizations, I mean, all organizations, or at least the ones who are successful, are quite keen on being clear on their values and their leadership principles. And the question is, why aren't we doing this globally then? Why aren't we, if we have sustainable development goals and we realize that we have some external goals, I mean, just like a company can have goals of markets they want to be in, or shares or profit they want to make. If we have these external goals together globally, Why aren't we doing our culture work together? Why aren't we reflecting and understanding that if we are conscious and deliberate on the skills that we want to grow and what kind of society and what kind of humans we want to create and what kind of leaders we want for our top positions.
What do you think China's view of that would be? Or what would India's view of that be? In their cultures or in their relationship between the individual and the state, for example, there is already a very different internal spiritual understanding of the relationship between the self and the society.
That question and point that the interviewer brings up at the end is an important one. If you value your own personal choice and freedom to develop yourself as you desire, you should be asking yourself, whose governmental system gets to define what the relationship looks like between the self and society, or the individual and the state when it comes to global values? China? Who gets to decide what our global society needs to experience health, well-being, thriving, and flourishing? And if that's tied to a political agenda, what transformational shifts does that require? I can tell you right off the bat, because the IDG folks say it themselves, that when they say inner development, they're mostly not referring to individual health, well-being, or flourishing, but to that of the collective and of the planet, with the resulting goal of that inner development being achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is a problem, because the United Nations believes that you don't have any rights that they don't give you, and that actions benefiting the collective good in service of the Sustainable Development Goals are more important than your individual rights. This is in direct conflict with American values, which assert that your rights come from God and that the purpose of government and your elected officials is to uphold and protect those rights. In case you're tempted not to take this Inner Development Goal initiative seriously, consider that Costa Rica and at least 5 other countries have already signed agreements to become nodes that adopt the IDGs across all their national policies. And the Inner Development Goals COO says in this video that as many as 25 countries are interested in it as well.
Costa Rica was the first country that in December said that we will adopt the Inner Development Goals in all our national policies. And now many countries are almost over the fence. Zambia and Rwanda and Greece, I would say, is the ones closest to jump on board. But we're talking to about 25 countries who wants to take this on board.
Some of the biggest US government agencies working with climate change are looking at integrating the IDG framework into their recommendation to all US schools and all US agencies and how to work with. Hopefully, we will be able to tell the good news in just 3 or 4 weeks that this is happening, and it's incredible. It's the first time the inner dimension is part of recommendations of how to work with climate change. And no matter if the IDG framework or not is included, the inner dimension is already there. The scientists are getting it, and it's a global shift in consciousness, if you are so to say.
In case you missed it in that second clip, the executive director of the IDGs mentioned just about a week ago that the US government is also interested in integrating the IDG framework across all government agencies as well as education. This means that all of these countries and our country's politicians, senior officials, and other people in positions of power, as well as our future leaders, will be trained in these 23 skills across 5 domains that are virtually identical to the 5 core competencies of social emotional learning. Notice the parallels. If you read the definitions of CASEL's, or the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning's competencies carefully, you'll get that self-awareness and self-management covers the IDG of being. Social awareness is thinking and relating. Relationship skills is both relating and collaborating. And responsible decision-making is acting. Why is it significant that the Inner Development Goals are essentially social emotional learning for adults? It's because the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, specifically said in this paper that they need social emotional learning, which I've exposed extensively in my other videos as a cultural and spiritual brainwashing program in K-12 education, to achieve the UN SDGs. The Inner Development Goals, like social emotional learning, is meant to rewire everyone's brains, not just students. That's why IDG partners like IKEA, Ericsson, Spotify, and Google plan to bring this into the workplace and have signed on to implement the inner development goals in their employee trainings, not just with their senior leaders, but the whole company, and also help push this into broader society.
Our theory of change has been that who has the resources to do this, to really not just train like a top leadership of leaders who can do this work, but to see that everybody has to do this work. Our thinking, who has the resources to do this, not just for the top leadership, but for everybody. And we say, of course, it's countries, and we want to work with countries, and it's organizations. So we have teamed up with some of the most progressive companies in the world, and you recognize many of these companies: IKEA, Spotify, Ericsson, Google, and so on. And they have said that we will support this initiative with sponsoring it, but we will also train all our employees in this. And of course, a big company like IKEA, have 150,000 employees, is a huge impact. And then some companies had also said that we will not just support this and train our employees, but we will also work to spread this in society. And I could give you lots of examples of this, but then I would have to kill you. And since I was, in an accident last week, I don't want to do that. So we're now talking to Apple, who said, we would like to have this in every iPhone. It will take us 1 or 2 years to work the internal bureaucracy, but we will get there. Our thinking was that if we want to buy in from countries and companies that we really need to do this work, then it has to be firmly rooted in science. So we teamed up with a number of universities, first Swedish university, like Stockholm University, Stockholm School of Economics, and Lund University, and then also international, Harvard, Erasmus, Paris University, and now a Danish Technical University.
You also heard Michael Wernstedt mention in this video how higher education institutions like the School of Economics in Stockholm, the Karolinska Institute, one of the world's foremost medical universities, Lund University, Harvard, and others have partnered with the Inner Development Goals initiative. Some of these institutions are even embedding the Inner Development Goal standards into their coursework. Listen to Lars Svensson, former president of the Stockholm School of Economics, a Swedish business school and staunch purveyor of the IDGs, talk about how they've been incorporating training and global competencies into their program to promote skills that businesses tell them they want future candidates to have.
In the case of SSD, we have a quite special and particular funding model where we only get some 20% of our funding from the government, and we have a huge amount actually of corporate partners. So we have something like 110 different corporate partners who help us a lot in funding the place. And my job is to a great extent asking them, what type of competence and knowledge do you need from our students? And what they say is quite simple. They say, we need students who have really profound specialized knowledge. They need to know what happens, what the relationship is between a balance sheet and a profit and loss statement, or what happens when the demand and supply curves meet when they are from here. But they also, to an increasing extent, speak about their future employees who need to be much more contextually savvy, sort of understand contexts. They need to be analytical, to be creative, and then what is more and more important every year is that they're speaking about culture and values of different kinds. So students need to really understand these things, and also the communication skills and their ability to be analytical and creative. And all these things is something that if our sponsors, in a way, if they don't see that this is happening too, if this is not what we're providing the students with, well, then they are not interested in hiring them, and thereby they're not interested in sponsoring us either. So this is something that we really need to do as we see it. So that's why we have started to sort of rethink a couple of years ago and say, what is education basically all about? What is it for? But it's not all that common that you articulate it and start thinking about how you actually increase sort of the C content or C intensity of every single program. But that is what we're doing now. And the way that we're doing it is we have our big initiative focusing on sustainable markets to understand all the sustainability challenges that we are facing. We have a global challenges program, contextual studies, focusing a lot on critical thinking and scientific mindset, basically on reflection and really understanding yourself, because we think this is something that's absolutely key.
It's not a stretch to imagine that, just like with SEL, these people in positions of power and future business leaders through their education will be pressured to overcome their cognitive dissonance to use their societal influence to make decisions that further the Sustainable Development Goals. What do I mean by cognitive dissonance? Cognitive dissonance is a mental state of psychological distress that occurs when your internal beliefs conflict with actions you take or are expected to take. The UN knows that the gigantic totalitarian changes they want to accomplish through the globalization and domination they're implementing through the SDGs don't always sit well with certain people who value individual rights and freedoms, because it can mean that those must be sacrificed to make their collective goals a reality. Then there are other people who experience cognitive dissonance because they want to help achieve the SDGs, but are overwhelmed with despair at the thought of what seems like a daunting task in a hopeless situation of climate collapse they've been coaxed into believing is going to inevitably happen. Either way, the cognitive dissonance these individuals are experiencing can only be brought down and resolved in one of three ways: changing beliefs, or changing action, which are the most difficult to convince someone to do, or that person changing their perception of the action they're being asked to do, which is what happens most often and usually results in that action not being taken at all. Changing the perception of the action could mean that they question the research behind the suggested action, that the cost of the action isn't worth the perceived benefits, and or that the action being asked of them conflicts with their internal beliefs so much that it is undeserving of the effort it would take to change their beliefs and actions. This is an obvious problem when it comes to the UN getting people to become agents of change so that their Sustainable Development Goals can be accomplished by 2030. In order to get what they want, they will have to figure out a way to rewire subjects' brains, as they said earlier, to change their beliefs and therefore their actions. UNESCO's SEL for SDGs paper described these as interventions because, quote, subjects of dissonance require emotional regulatory capabilities or emotional resilience to navigate the behaviors and prerequisite antecedents, meaning the beliefs and mindsets you need ahead of time to attain the SDGs. They go on to say that, quote, explicit training in SEL build competencies that might empower and enable individuals to regulate emotional response. And then introduce a framework called EMC2 that provides explicit training in 4 competencies that they believe will build emotional resilience and promote what they call pro-social behavior. In other words, taking action for the SDGs. SEL in the education sector and the IDGs in other sectors are these interventions we're talking about that will utilize the competencies of that creepy EMC2 acronym that harkens back to Einstein's equation of special relativity to manipulate all people to take action under the guise of inner development and positive mental health initiatives. Let's take their goal to achieve net zero emissions as an example. There's no question that a transition from fossil fuels to more sustainable sources could mean energy scarcity that could lead to death and a massive inflation of energy prices. Those who believe in individuality and personal freedom over the collective good will not choose to support their goals, and so they need to be brainwashed through the weaponization of empathy, mindfulness, compassion, and the creation of critical inquiry, or in other words, creating a critical consciousness in people in order to override their existing internal beliefs. Similarly, the poor youth that they've scared half to death that the world is going to end because of climate change need to be coaxed through their paralysis that keeps them from taking action by teaching them resilience and emotional regulation. All of this training in social emotional skills is so that individuals exhibit what UNESCO calls pro-social behavior. In other words, actions that further the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The long-term plan with the Inner Development Goals is to implement them across every sector in every country across the globe. Alarmingly, the process for this has already begun in the EU. The role of the IDGs to help with the SDGs was highlighted in this resolution that was recently adopted in June of 2022. Under the Budget and Financing section, in number 50, it says, quote, underlines the importance of SDG 17, Partnerships for the Goals, notes in the framework of global partnerships and capacity building, the innovative role of open source initiatives such as the Inner Development Goals Initiative that aim to educate, inspire, and empower people to be a positive force for change in society, thereby accelerating progress toward achieving the SDGs. The open source platform they're referring to is twofold. The IDG folks recently put out an IDG Toolkit website, which they say is like Wikipedia meets Trustpilot for inner development. It has specific methods, tools, exercises, and resources for anyone to try out, and visitors can even suggest different exercises to grow the 23 skills so they can, quote, help people and organizations accelerate progress toward the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are, as an extension of this, curating a community of practitioners ready and equipped to scale their framework into all areas of society that they work in, including the public sector, education, business, the third sector, and more. They also intend to expand the practice of implementing the IDGs through their partner networks in academia and business, and the 250 and growing hubs they have in over 65 countries. You can see the full list at www.interdevelopmentgoals.org/community#hubs. But this screenshot shows you that there are at least 22 of those hubs located all around the United States. Another way the IDGs are spreading is through the 29K app, a mental health platform which is being advocated for use in the organizations and institutions that are partnered with the IDGs. After downloading the app, users can practice their inner development goal skills as well as meet up through video chat, and just like happens with SEL in schools, have vulnerable circle time even with complete strangers if they so desire. This is a part of the IDG's third phase of development to globalize and normalize the connection of inner development to outer societal transformation, with the intention of getting the public to change their attitudes and their actions to further the SDGs.
In relationship to these inner development goals, what would you say your priorities are?
So just linking that if people grow in some inner capacities, that there will actually be a bigger chance that they will engage successfully with the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, just that we have Templeton Foundation coming in and doing a study where we will test this out, this hypothesis in 5 countries, Costa Rica being one of them, Rwanda probably another, and they want to sponsor in low or middle income countries. So proving, or at least exploring the inner-outer connection is one of the big things that we would like to look for partners and do together with others, and say, here is a group of people, they go through some kind of capacity building, and is there actually an effect in the way they enact towards the SDGs afterwards, or feel that they have the capacity to do so. But the best scenario is actually doing and having priorities that are more in line with SDGs. The second part is the validation study that I spoke about, where we have now Google. I'm trying to get some other international organizations, and I'm looking with somebody who's good with big data, who can help us process input from hundreds of thousands of people when we look at validating this framework and making it into a truly co-creative framework that can be used globally and that people can relate to. And the third part is the methods, and to create something that is where people can find inspiration to grow in whatever way they find is meaningful or helpful for them. So this is the 3 parts that we're aiming at in the next phase.
Just like you heard the executive director of the Inner Development Goals, Jan Artem Henriksen, say, this third phase of development includes partnering with tech giants like Google and others to figure out the management of this vast amounts of data they're collecting through both their pilot leadership programs in 8 countries and the one-question survey they're planning to administer to 2 million people in order to validate and update the IDG framework so that it can be pushed globally. Why also do they need to figure out how to collect vast amounts of data? Well, just as companies like Panorama have done the students' values, attitudes, and beliefs in social emotional learning, Those who want to influence our inner development need to have ways to measure quantitatively whether or not their trainings and interventions to change our beliefs and actions toward the SDGs are actually working. SEL and IDG skills will eventually be tracked and recorded as data that follows the individual from cradle to grave under the guise of lifelong learning. When incorporated into a virtual credentials wallet as a competency score, like they want to do with initiatives like the Internet of Education, which will allow employment and education to be connected and share data through blockchain, and then that eventually gets absorbed into a full-fledged digital ID, these social emotional or inner development goal competencies, or the lack thereof, could mean rewards or punishments for you based upon how successful they are. Maybe that means incentives like a promotion at work, or like in China, the inability to travel if you do things like participate in a political rally that the government doesn't agree with. That could bring your inner development or social credit score down. Even though the IDG framework will further along the adoption of a social credit system, like what happened with social emotional learning, the inner development goals will be brought into our systems and institutions as a Trojan horse by lying and manipulating language to get the buy-in of unsuspecting conservative lawmakers and businessmen under the guise of providing positive mental health supports and personal leadership development.
We are packaging the framework in a Western package deliberately because it's a cure for the Western mind by the Western mind. It's not the people in the East with much more complex understanding who are causing the troubles. It's this Western capitalistic systems that we have invented. And maybe it's like a Trojan horse here again, where we need to start with something that is very paradoxical. I mean, inner development goals, but people get it instantly, especially Westerners. It has a point to be presented, if we talk about spiral dynamics, in a very orange costume, very much, let's make this efficiently, let's, if we are to reach the sustainable development goals, we have a blind spot and we need to address it, and we call it the inner development goals. And everybody knows who are into complexity, this is not how it works. But in the world where we live today, integral theory, meta-modern philosophy that I've been passionate about for years, does not make a big bang. And I think the inner development goals is that step that can get people interested and get them into more complex frameworks, theories, ways of thinking, and could be something that open doors for this. There is something in making it simple, understandable for many people, conservatives as progressives. And if we are to lean somewhere, I think we really need to lean to get the people that we usually leave behind, like the conservatives, like the ones who do think that this is new age, fluffy stuff. And how do we speak about inner development to those who are skeptical, rather to those who are already loving it and are meta-modern thinkers and philosophers?
You must understand that the main goal of measuring all of this, social emotional learning, environmental, social, and governance scores, and the inner development goals, is to change our economy from a capitalist model to a well-being or post-growth model, which is code for communism. In a future video, I plan to dive more into what the well-being economy is, who's behind it, and why. Just know for now that the inner development goals is just one piece of a much larger movement to implement policies that bring us into a collective consciousness or hive mind. A hive mind that's okay with the complexities of an economy that plans to redistribute wealth and resources based on social determinants of health under the guise of providing well-being for all. I'm going to conclude this presentation as I started it by playing the same clips from the IDG film. But now that you know more about it, listen carefully to what they're saying and understand what this means for both you and our society. We must fight back against this and educate those around us about what's coming for them. Please like and share this video and subscribe to my channel for more content. Thanks for watching.
The inner development goals show what inner shifts or human growth needs to happen in order for us to increase our chances of reaching the sustainable development goals collectively.
we need to sort of focus more inwards, and what is my responsibility in that? What can I contribute to a development that is more sustainable? But in order to be able to reach those sustainability goals, we need to also be able to take the right decisions to get there.
Mental health and well-being is supported by our inner capacities for spirituality and faith, where education is fundamentally oriented towards meaning and purpose in a changing world, rather than mere content delivery for students.
I realize more and more that we cannot reach the sustainability goals if we do not work with our inner development. This does not apply only to universities. This applies to all sectors, all ages.
What we really need is a deliberately developmental society. And depending on how severe you think the situation is, maybe we need a deliberately developmental world. And right now, we're not even talking about at scale the inner dimensions and how we need to change. Because at the core, we are the problem. The way that we're acting in the world and the way that we are solving problems is the problem.
I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation.
We bring now the inner development goals with us as a great source of inspiration when we strengthen and revise our competence development roadmaps and make sure that the inner development goals are integrated into this.
To make the world work better requires highly specialized skills. So what we want to say to people is, yes, it's great that you want to help make the world work better, but you have to get into training.